Hey everyone, welcome back. Amy, Susan, Luke, thank you again for your talks, and everyone really for being part of this conversation. Maybe I can open up the conversation in the Q&A. So Amy, Susan, Luke, it's a broad one, but it's something that's been on my mind and has come up in our design studio. So I'm coordinating the first year design studio. And really questioning the idea of standards. Amy, I thought your talk was really interesting, but talking about this idea of really questioning the standard that we design to. And the question I have is, like, so how do we even start? And where do we start? And this comes partly from a question that a student asked that stuck with me for the past few weeks. That they're quite aware. I can design to my own abilities. I know my own abilities. I know my own dimensions, what I am comfortable with. But how do we design spaces, and how do we even start where, to design spaces where everyone feels welcome and emotionally and physically comfortable and able, everyone feels empowered, given the kind of incredible range of people, spectrum of abilities, genders, races, religions. Like, is there suggestions or strategies that you would have for starting the design process to make sure we can consider this kind of, incredible diversity of people that we're designing for?
This is Amy speaking. I can say a little bit because I think this is such a great question and such an important one. And it's one that gets asked a lot with a kind of sense of overwhelm sometimes, like this overwhelm of how could I possibly know all of the kinds of people that are in the world and design for every need. And a really important thing to know is that disabled people have been working on this problem for a very long time. And no one is reinventing the wheel, hopefully, but no one's starting from scratch. And so there are precedents and there are projects and struggles to look to. And that part of how accessibility gets made is actually through struggle and friction and trial and error. And so there are histories of architecture to look to, and there are histories of activism to look to. And those are all before you even start engaging with like individual users. And then, it's just really important to think about what knowledge base you're drawing on and who you're engaging. Historically, there has been a lot more representation, for example, of white disabled people in disability activism. And now that like the public face of that is changing in certain ways. And so like making sure to connect to people who are thinking about race and who are thinking about housing status and documentation status and gender as ways of broadening the types of questions that we can ask. Because when we talk about standards, what we're really talking about is accountability. Like, what is the baseline at which we feel comfortable and accountable toward our communities? And that requires like building relationships with communities and making ourselves part of communities and bringing in the communities that we are part of. All of that has to exist before the design process. So I actually think of accessibility in that way as part of like transformative justice or part of abolition, because we are getting rid of the idea that the state is the one that decides how we are accountable toward each other. And we're engaging in these kinds of experimental processes with each other, knowing that sometimes we are going to do harm and sometimes we're not going to be perfect. But if we kind of like build the right kinds of relationships around that, we can like repair that more readily than if we were to, think that there is just like one standard solution.
This is Susan. I'll just jump in quickly to say that on our toilet project, as I mentioned, it's like, we realized very quickly that in order to implement the kinds of design we were thinking of, that it would require getting a building code variance in most places, because the International Plumbing Code mandates that for facilities that serve more than like X number of people per day, that it's like that they're mandated to have men's and women's public toilets. And so that we found there's just like, 2 lines in the plumbing code that we figured out if we changed those 2 lines, it would take down that barrier. It wouldn't mandate the construction of, a multi-user gender neutral space, but it would prevent the non-consensual position of a gender binary. And so while I agree completely with what Amy was saying about, the state doesn't offer the solution necessarily, is not what, ideally I think you would like to go to. It's like, it does make sense when the state is putting up a barrier that you take that barrier down, and that we found a way to do that it took us 2 years of lobbying with the people who put out the IPC to change that line. But it actually wasn't all that difficult. I mean, we kind of did this stealth campaign, and the people who were revising the code, they're like, oh yeah, that's perfectly reasonable. We can make that change. It doesn't mandate anything, and it creates kind of a more flexible built environment. So yeah, that's how we dealt with code issues.
For us, it was it's all about disruption. we threw those ramps on the ground and knew that they didn't conform to current building code and public right-of-way encroachment bylaws. We recognized those to be really big issues that were preventing us as Ontarians from reaching our goal of living in a fully barrier-free province by 2025. That's legislation. That's enacted legal act that we as Ontarians enjoy, and there's a big issue between the legislation and these antiquated bylaws, and by stirring the pot and putting these brightly painted ramps on the public right of way, knowing that they contravene municipal encroachment bylaws, put them out there, and we sort of sat back and took note of the feedback. And to date, we have received very little negative feedback, but we take it all in. We put it out there, and we take in all of the feedback and deem it equally important, the good and the bad, because it is an iterative approach. Susan used that term iteration in her presentation, and that really resonates with me, because it's not a perfect solution. It's a stopgap measure. We know that it's not perfect, but it's a start, and we got to start somewhere. We know, as Amy alluded to, that it might rub people the wrong way and maybe cause harm. I believe that's what Amy said. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, the beginning of change has to start, in my opinion, with disruption, and it is likely not going to be perfect. And that's okay.
Thank you. That was awesome. There are a few questions in the chat. First one is, what might accessibility in architecture for neurodiverse, such as ADHD, autism, etc., people look like?
This is Amy speaking. I can kind of take a stab at this because I fit into this category. Historically, there are not a lot of standards that cover things like sensory overwhelm in built environments, or flashing lights, or kind of like feelings of like spaciousness versus enclosure and things like that. And it's hard to say what a standard form of accessibility may be like, because neurodivergent people also, we have like very diverging needs. But one that I have been talking about a lot is that like the world at night has become basically completely inaccessible to me with the introduction of LED lighting into public spaces. Because LED lighting is so bright, it emits a sound that some people like me can hear. And it has a flicker, and it's actually worse than fluorescence. So it's like introduced for sustainability reasons, but it just like makes the world extremely painful. I can't drive at night anymore, etc. And so these are the sorts of things that like if an autistic person or someone with ADHD had been designing urban street lighting, that never would have happened. And it kind of also shows like that there's a lack of consultation around those kinds of things too.
Okay. Unless, I mean, Luke or Susan wants to fill in the gap, I'll ask another question. Okay. Adrian, I see here you asked one. I'm going to jump to a student, and then we can sort of circle back to yours. This is from Amy, who is in first year. So, Amy, you can chime in if you would like to read it out loud. Otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and read it for you. For our upcoming first year project, which is to create our own home, do you have any comment on how we can begin to think about providing flexible home designs, other than bathrooms, in giving access to different people living in its space? Or any tips on how we can begin to think about implementing this to our project?
It is a big question. I appreciate it being asked because of how important accessible home design is. If we go north, maybe a half hour, 45 minutes north of Toronto, we get into suburbia, and chances are most of those new developments in suburbia all have 3 to 4 step walk-ups. If they're detached homes and townhomes in that part of the world and in most areas, suburban areas, also have walk-ups, which is a huge issue. I believe it's one of the worst uses of human resources, because we're putting all of this effort and energy and these building materials into a housing stock that isn't accessible. So all to say, this question is really, really important. I can just list off a couple of things that I would see as highly beneficial. If there was someone who was living in the home, that's a bit of a different design exercise than someone who might simply be visiting the home. So to design for a home to be visitable, it is to have a ground level access and a bathroom that is accessible. So for a home to be fully accessible, it's best if it's just all one level, and that the furniture is modular. Modular furniture is in my opinion a really, really great way to go. It's not my area of expertise, but just as a homeowner I know the benefit of having furniture that's movable. It's easily movable, and that has ground level access throughout. The big one, I don't want to take up too much time if anybody else has anything that they'd like to share.
We actually have.
Oh yeah. Well, I was just going to say, just like very, very, very quickly, that the thing that really strikes me here is that most of my thinking about design and accessibility in relationship to trans questions, I'm just struck by how much that in the apps, while being trans can create barriers to access for you in public space, it's like what I really realize is that most of the trans related problems are about public accommodation and public access, and that it's really not as much a domestic question. That, in the absence of, some mobility, difficulty, or, being, somewhere on the neurodiversity spectrum, that sort of an so-called able-bodied trans person is usually not particularly unaccommodated in their own home. It's like if it's their space, but it really is a public question. So it's like really thinking about the way that gender binary gets encoded into public space is like where I see the greatest connection between trans-related design issues and disability design issues. So, just an observation.
Yeah, and I think I'm gonna call on. We have a brave student who's willing to sort of ask a question out loud. I think that's Ezra.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I couldn't see the chat. Susan, this one is for you. I like the design of the bathroom. I think it's really interesting. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on how it would work at a smaller scale, maybe 4 stalls instead of a larger airport bathroom, and if safety and a feeling of inclusiveness would continue in a smaller scale.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. I've seen some work that's done kind of implementing some of the ideas that we came up with in K-12 public schools, and like with not high schools, but like sort of elementary schools where like there's smaller numbers of students using it. So I do think prototypes that I've seen would work for smaller numbers of people, and that the basic design idea really is that how you abolish a gender binary that creates unequal access to people who don't embody that binary somehow. It's really about changing the relationship between bathroom space and public space. It's that removing the wall to the corridor circulation space that we actually figured out was crucial, to say that you make the toilet space be as safe as public space in general. That doesn't necessarily mean perfectly safe, but it means it's no less safe than being in public. And that, you think about public space and there's any numbers of bodies moving around in public space, who are different from one another. And that while, you can have public danger, it's like you don't want to make the bathroom a more dangerous place because it creates a little cul-de-sac where, say, like somebody who is looking to be a predator, it's like knows where to find certain kinds of people they want to victimize. It's like you make as much of the bathroom space a public space as possible, that you make you use privacy for bodily functions you want to be private, like mostly like elimination, that you make grooming functions a little bit more publicly accessible, and that, everything is kind of like taking place out in public space. So it's like, yeah, I do think that basic design principle works as well in smaller places than it does in larger places. One final thing, I'll quit talking. It's like I went to a restaurant in Brooklyn once. It was just a barbecue restaurant, and that they were basically, without ever having talked to us, it's like they were implementing the same ideas that we had in their toilet. It's like you could, like, from sitting at the bar, you could look back into a room, see a sink, and there were a row of doors on either side that had 3 different stalls in it with fully closable doors. It was all done on the cheap. It wasn't, it's all very vernacular, like off the shelf kinds of, building materials. But it created exactly the kind of shared and quasi-public toilet space that, we had spent a lot of time thinking about. They just kind of came up with it on their own. So I do think that the design principles work pretty darn well. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, this is sorry, Ezra, did you want to say, maybe I saw you talking.
I was just going to say thank you.
Yeah.
So this is our last question, and I'm going to end on Adrian's question because I think it's sort of a good way to segue into our sort of closing remarks. And Adrian's just wondering if each of you could suggest a specific idea that you've been dreaming of realizing to exceed existing spatial standards, and sort of mentions that he thinks Stalled is a good example of this. So I guess each of you can comment.
Well, since I just talked, I think I'll skip this question.
I would also like to see Stalled implemented. I think that would be beneficial for a lot of people, including me.
I third that.
I'll let Joel know.
Stalled out there.
Get it unstalled and installed instead. Yeah.
Beautiful. I would love for our awareness raising project to be recognized in every municipality, certainly in Canada, but the issue of stepped entryways is a global issue, and it requires a lot of conversation on all levels, both from retailers, building owners, different levels of government. So to start the conversation in every municipality would be the moonshot, and then ultimately not having to deal with those stepped entryways. The picture, Amy, that you showed of the feature staircase was also something that I noted in your presentation. Getting conversation started about our fixation on monumental staircases. Up with that.
Thank you all. And Luke, one thing that I really noticed, walking down different streets in Toronto, was it really brought to mind, or kind of my awareness of who didn't have the ramps in front of their stores or restaurants, and why. And so I think it also brings up that discussion as to it's there, why not use it? But I did want to thank everyone for this incredibly important discussion, the conversations, the questions, your attention on a Tuesday evening. And a very, very special thank you to Luke, Amy, and Susan for the generosity of your time, your knowledge and your insights. And I'm just fascinated by your work, and I can't wait to read and to hear more. But before we end for the night, I would want to bring everyone's attention to a student-led workshop that's being run to extend and facilitate a deeper discussion on this topic, and to have us take some action. So next Friday, October 30th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Treaty Lands Global Stories and the Sustainability Collective, they're going to be leading a work session in collaboration with the project Vector Vault for students to learn how to create their own vectors while exploring the importance of representation in architectural drawings and how it can play a role in increasing accessibility in our designs. And so more details will be sent in the coming days about that. Thank you very, very much, everyone, and hope you have a great night. Thank you to our speakers and to all of you for attending tonight.